Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Carrie Gillen.
And I'm Megan Figueroa. And we have one housekeeping item before we get into the episode, and we have another email. This is our third email. We're just going to keep counting because this is how exciting that is. And it's from the Ivory Coast. Hello, Carrie and Megan. I was listening to your Freaky Friday episode today, and you gave a shout out to the Ivory Coast. So I figured I'd say hi and introduce myself as your listener in the Ivory Coast. Wait, so we have more than one, right?
Well, unless she's downloading like 50 copies of each episode or something. Yeah, no, she's not the only one.
I mean, but to each their own. That's what she's doing. Okay, back to the email. You probably looked at your stats and thought, that's weird.
Yeah, I did.
That's
kind of said.
That's what Carrie did. Okay. Anyways, I've listened to all but your most recent episode now, and I really enjoy them. I found out about you through Lingthusiasm. Thank you, Lingthusiasm.
Thank you.
And I'm really glad you have a show about this topic, since it's one I'm passionate about too, although I usually come at it from a different angle. I'm an English teacher and teacher trainer, and linguicism, the term I usually use for linguistic discrimination, although I usually have to include a gloss since it's unfortunately not in common use yet, is one of the areas I'm passionate about, especially how it intersects with race and gender. Within TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages, there are a lot of linguistic discrimination issues that come up, both in the discrimination that English learners face, but also in hiring practices that favor native speakers over non-native English-speaking teachers. If you're looking for new areas to cover in future episodes, the linguicism faced by language learners and language teachers and the role that native speakerism plays in perpetuating standard language ideologies seems very much connected to the type of things you talk about on the show. Earlier this year, I actually wrote an article about this. If you're interested, it's online here, and we'll link to it. Mm-hmm. Anyways, I thought I'd say hi and let you know I appreciate what you're doing and enjoying listening from here in the Ivory Coast. Thank you very much, Raya.
I like how she adds the pronunciation.
Yes, like rye bread. I love it.
I love it too. Thank you so much for that.
No, I know. I have to do that with my dog. My dog's name is Rilo, but it's spelled like Relo. So, I mean.
Yeah, it could be pronounced either way.
Especially if you're a Spanish speaker, right? Because there's no like I sound in Spanish, so.
Or basically any other European language.
Sure.
English is the odd one out. I also want to point out that Raya's suggestion was actually also given to me by one of my former students, Edward. So this is clearly a topic that needs to be discussed. And it's not just about native versus non-native. It's also about which varieties are acceptable and which are not. So you could be, say, an English speaker from India, and that would not be the kind of dialect that schools would want, probably. Right. So, yeah, I do think we should talk about it, and it's on the list.
Isn't the British accent favorable?
English, North American.
Oh, it is?
It depends on the school, depends on the location, but they're definitely, like, a lot of schools want American or Canadian teachers over some other varieties. Yeah.
Well, that's definitely something we should talk about, since I have a lot of questions about it. And I'm sure other people do too, because I think from Twitter, from what I can tell, we do have a lot of like TESOL English teacher type listeners.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
very exciting. All right.
And today we're going to talk about Appalachian or Appalachian English,
Yes.
and we're gonna ask our guest how it's actually pronounced.
Yes, he's from Appalachia.
This kind of reminds me also of Copenhagen Hagen. Apparently, everyone pronounces it incorrectly, so the way that they mock us for pronouncing it incorrectly is saying Copenhagen Hagen.
That's fun. It's also
Yes.
like thinking about Arizona, if you say Prescott versus Prescott.
Yes.
If someone says Prescott, you're like, oh, where are you from? It's not Arizona.
Speaking of that, there was an episode of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend where there was supposed to be a character from Prescott, and he pronounced it Prescott,
No.
and I was like, nope.
See, you gotta get an Arizonan in the room. That's what that means.
Or even just ask.
Yeah.
If it's just like one word, one name, you don't have to have someone in the room.
That's true.
Maybe you should make sure that you really know how to pronounce the place names, because place names are the most variable, I would say.
Yes. Don't think that the easy, obvious spelling is actually how you pronounce it. Because Prescott is like pretty odd. Like looks like Scott. So I got you.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to introduce our guest. Dr. Paul Reed is an assistant professor in the Department of Communicative Disorders at the University of Alabama. He researches phonetics and sociophonetics, sociolinguistics, speech perception, and language processing, and other aspects of Southern and Appalachian Englishes. We want to ask you, Paul, how do you say that?
For us, it's always Appalachian.
It's always Appalachian.
Yeah. Now, granted, if you go a little further north, if you go past West Virginia, then you may get some Latian and stuff like that. But it's a bit of those that. So growing up, the reason that it's always Latchin for us. Mm-hmm. So during the War on Poverty, the Appalachian Volunteers, the AVs, they came into our region and they wanted to help. And so usually this was well-meaning college students, but they also kind of came with a bit of a, we know how to fix you. And so a lot of them had Latia. And so growing up, it was always a marker of an outsider, usually with a particular view of our region that said Latia. So it's kind of one of those shibboleths for certain areas of the region, especially in southern Appalachia, where it's a little bit more, where it was more rural and the poverty was more widespread and didn't get so much of the effects of the war on poverty until much later.
Okay, so Appalachia.
Yes.
Okay, I will.
We won't kick you out for anything. So no
worries. I mean, I know. I'm sure you're all. I just do not want to signal that I think any less of anyone. So. But we're so grateful for you to be talking with us today.
Thank you.
So thank you for being here.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very
much. First off, I mean, I can put the two together and figure out what it is, but tell us what sociophonetics is.
Sure. So sociophonetics is a branch of sociolinguistics. So sociolinguistics is looking at the intersection of language and social groupings, or language and society. So sociophonetics just takes that and brings it down to a phonetic level. So it looks at how different groups of people with different identities, people from different areas, how they phonetically manipulate their production. So something as finely grained as, how do your vowels change? How the slight differences in consonant articulations and things like that. And so it's sort of the same kind of idea, but it's done at a phonetic level. And the only thing that makes it a little harder is, so sometimes we want to exercise as much control over the stimuli or the recording as someone in like a phonetics lab. But we also want the most natural speech possible. So you try to use as much control as possible in a way to, but at the same time trying to get as natural. So you try to, move someone into the quietest room of their house, preferably with lots of curtains and carpets, and we'll get away from things like fridges and air conditioners and stuff like that. And you mic them up and you hope for the best. I did have one recording. It was funny. It was a 94-year-old participant, and she was great. But she was on an oxygen machine. So we talked for a long time, but certain things I couldn't do with her recording because obviously I can't ask her to turn that off. But I was able to use the qualitative stuff. So it was one of those. It was like, so close.
Well, isn't that the problem? I mean, not a problem, just like something to overcome a bit for all sociolinguists is the natural versus like, are they kind of, what is it called? Speaker, like when you're there with them.
Observer,
and, like,
the observer effect. Yes.
Yes, that.
Yeah, it is. That's sort of an issue for everyone. But, if someone, you can just unobtrusively set a recorder down and people can forget about it. If you've mic'd them up, and even if you've, some people even put like a mic connected with a little over the ear thing, it's harder to get them to forget about that. So because they're literally connected to it. Although the one thing, so with my work, I was able to go back home. And so I was sitting across from people that knew me, that knew my parents, that knew my grandparents. So there was a bit of time where people just sort of forgot. Because they were sitting down with somebody that they knew. They were sitting down with little Paul Reed, which if you guys have ever seen me, that's kind of a funny misnomer because I'm about 6'8". So it's sort of like little Paul Reed is it's kind of funny because everyone from my hometown calls me that because my dad's name was Paul too, and he was Big Paul and I'm Little Paul. So even though I haven't really been little for 20 years.
I'm guessing he's shorter than you too at this point.
He was about 6'4". So
okay.
So he was big. He just didn't wind up being as big as his son did.
You're like Little John.
Exactly. Yes.
So then, would you say then that you speak Appalachian English?
Yes. Yeah, I would say that I'm definitely a native speaker.
Okay.
So one of the questions I have is, what are the boundaries for Appalachia versus the rest of the South? And connected to that also is like, how is the language different from this region versus the rest?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's always one of those that, so there's the official designation of Appalachia, which is set forth by the Appalachian Regional Commission, division of the federal government. And so there are 410 counties over 13 states, stretching literally from about Jackson, Mississippi, all the way up into western New York. So people hear that and they're like, that's huge.
Yeah.
But of course, when most people think Appalachia, they don't think all the way from, Mississippi to New York. They think usually about, and we call it the core region. And that's sort of where it's the whole state of West Virginia, Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, and a little bit of a smidge of the other states connecting. So Northeast Alabama, North Georgia, maybe a little cut of South Carolina. That's the core region, and that's where the features are. There are more of them. That's sort of the core region where people inside and outside the region would say that's definitely Appalachia. And as far as what differentiates it from the rest of the South, it's really, honestly, most times a quantitative rather than a qualitative difference. So things like the Southern vowel shift, where you have the monophthongization of I. So in words like price, or price, and prize, you have monophthongization in all of those contexts at a much higher rate than in other areas. So in large parts of the South, you'll only get it in pre-voiced and open syllable, so prize, pri. But in Appalachia, you'll also get it in pre-voiceless conditions, so price. And so, and you'll have it approaching categorical. I mean, there's a lot of individual variation, which is sort of what my work looked at. So that's one of the features. But then also, you have a few grammatical structures that occur more often or in more context. So things like double modals. So that's combinations like might, could, might, should, may, can.
I love that.
You have those all over. So might, could is pretty widespread. I mean, you get that from, almost to Arizona, all the way to...
Yeah,
all the way to the East Coast.
Yeah.
But in Appalachia, you have more of them in more conditions. So I personally have might, could, might, can, may, could, might, should, may, should, will, can, used to, could, used to, would, should, oughta, should, might, should, oughta. And then I can also make questions. And so things where, and this is where some work that I've done is sort of started to tease apart the difference between like the core area and the periphery. So when you make a question, usually you'll take the second modal and move it. So it'll be like, should you might do this? And that's the sort of the typical way. And some people are just like, no, that's terrible. What are you doing? You've just butchered the language.
Right.
And that's sort of one of the things of just being able to, all of the different combinations in a lot of different contexts and more of them, and able to do things like form questions or, where you put the negation, because you can say, might not should, or might should not, might couldn't. And so and how much, contraction you allow and where you allow the negation to appear is sort of one of the features that starts to distinguish the region, along with, of course, a lot of lexical items. So, and this is where it gets fun, because, it's a region with a lot of creativity. So people do a lot of things that aren't necessarily completely unusual, but it's very creative. So I remember growing up, people would say things like, man, he's the workingest man I ever saw.
Ooh,
and you've basically added, a superlative to to working, which is interesting. And of course, people can immediately parse what you mean, but it's not necessarily something you're going to produce. And some other lexical items, there's all sorts of terms for things. So I was teaching this a couple of weeks ago to my students, and most of them are from the South, because at the University of Alabama, a lot of people are from the South, and one of my students is from Northeast Alabama, so in Appalachia, and she said, "Dr. Reed, do you know all the words for moonshine?" I'm like, "Well, I know some of them." And so we started comparing the words we have for moonshine. So of course you've got shine, moonshine. This is my personal favorite, "Oh, be joyful."
That is great. Yeah. I've never heard that before.
Yeah. So so people say, "You got any oh be joyful?" And so that's another one. And then one other, and this is one that I didn't even realize until I was in graduate school, that not everyone uses this. It's called the alternative one. And so it's very common to say something like, "Yeah, we should probably do that Monday or Tuesday one," in the sense of one or the other, but you sort of just put both options and then one after it, and the interlocutor would understand, oh, you're giving me a choice here. But not everybody does that. And I remember saying that to a friend of mine and got the blank look of, I don't think I know what you mean. And so there are some features that are maybe not necessarily unique, but they're quantitatively different, and then there are some that are probably on the border of being qualitatively different, but it's kind of hard to say because the borders are definitely sort of fuzzy. But a lot of those, and the closer you get to that core area that I was talking about, more people will have more of them and in more contexts.
So then would you say that non-linguists or people just listening to a Southern American English speaker and then an Appalachian English speaker, would they be able to tell the difference, or you have to be more of a trained ear?
You can tell the difference, but what you often get is somebody will say, "You sound really Southern," or "You sound really country," or for whatever reason, people will also think you're from Texas. So you get, "Are you from Texas?"
Oh,
no. We Tennesseans, we saved Texas. So they're the only reason that they're, so we saved them. And so when I lived in Texas, I made sure I brought that up as much as possible, which was probably a faux pas, but it's all right.
Okay. So their dialect is going to be different than
there's some, like in East Texas, because there were a lot of people from the Mid-South that went to Texas. So East Texas in and around Houston and a little further north, there were a lot of Tennesseans and Eastern Kentuckians and those that went. So there are some similarities. So it's not completely off the wall, but it's definitely something that is shifted and morphed. Because we're talking about the 1830s and 1840s. So there's been a lot of change. But people will say things like, "You sound really Southern," and that's that's usually what you get. Not necessarily that they don't recognize. They recognize there's a difference, but they don't really know what that difference is. Sometimes within the South, you may get the country, that somebody sounds really country. And that's what you get a lot. Because in the South as a whole, there's a big urban-rural divide. Because, a lot of the cities have, really grown in the last, 50 years. And so the distinction between urban and rural has grown. And so you'll get a lot of that. You sound really really country? Are you from the sticks? Are you from the boonies? You know, so that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So there's some notion that it's not necessarily associated with urban areas, but very rarely does get somebody say, "Are you from Appalachia?" You know, usually you'll get, "Are you country?" And which there's also that in a lot of people's minds, it's kind of the same thing.
Right. Also, mountain folk, right?
Yes, yeah. So you'll get some mountain folk, but that's usually from people very close to the region that live and they know and they've been able to see that distinction. So even though, for example, like where I went to college in Knoxville, Tennessee, is considered part of Appalachia and very close by, people would know that, oh, you're from the mountains, and that's because Knoxville's in the valley, and within Appalachia, the valley and mountain or valley and ridge distinction is pretty salient because as Appalachia was settled, people settled in the valleys first, and that was sort of where there was better land, and if you were people of a certain means, you could get some land in the bottomland and along the rivers and valleys. And if you came a little bit later, or you didn't have as much, as many resources, you had to get higher and higher because the land was cheaper and cheaper. And so there's a distinction, and even to this day, there's a little bit between the valley and the ridge. And because my wife is from the valley, and she's not. I mean, we grew up maybe 50, 60 miles apart, not very far. But there are certain things that I say that she doesn't say, and certain idioms and sayings, and sometimes the way that we say things is a little distinct, which is kind of funny because, again, we're both from East Tennessee. We're not from that far apart, but there's there's definitely some distinctions.
Cool.
Like anywhere. I mean, anywhere has distinctions, but it's just sort of people in people's minds are like, oh, you're both from East Tennessee, you're going to sound the same. No, not really.
Do you think people are picking up on the phonology, the lexical items? What is it that they're picking up on when they say, are you from the boonies or whatever? What is it they're picking up on, do you think?
I think the times that it's happened to me, it's usually been a combination that I've said something with my phonology, but it's a saying or a grammatical structure that they're not familiar with. Another time when I was in college, I was one of my teammates. He was I played basketball, so he wanted to he needed to ride to the airport, and I said, "Sure, man, I don't care at all to take you." And he's like, "Okay, I'll go ask somebody else." And I'm like, "Why would you do that? I just told you I'd take you." He said, "No, you didn't. You said you don't care to take me." I said, "Exactly. I don't care at all. I'd love to take you." And he just gave me this sort of this blank look of just, that doesn't compute, man. But it was one of those that we had this sort of a misunderstanding of just, I thought with my intonation and facial expression that he knew that I was going to take him. And so things like that, that's when it was like, he's like, "Man, you country people," which was a joke. My teammates would call me the Mountain Man or Paul Bunyan, so that's sort of part of that is a little bit of a joke. But I mean, there was something like that. So I think the combination of the phonology and something that was kind of took a minute, like there was a little bit of a miscommunication.
Yeah, I would have interpreted it the same way he did.
Yeah, me too.
So if somebody is from the Appalachia, potentially other parts of the South, don't care to is not always negative, especially with I don't care to take you at all. So
yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. One of the reasons we wanted to talk to you was because what's his name? J.D. Vance was back in the news.
Yes.
Do you have any feelings towards his work?
I have lots of feelings about J.D. Vance. Some of them probably will need to be edited slightly. No, I'm just kidding.
You can swear if you want. We swear on this.
Yeah. We have an explicit rating.
So J.D. Vance he's full of what makes the grass grow green in lots of ways. Because the main thing is that if his autobiography were his own story, the story of a child from a broken home that got access to education, had some people that mentored him and made good. He was able to attend some fine colleges and make really he did well for himself. If that were his book, then it would be great. But the fact that first and foremost a 30-year-old is writing an autobiography, and not an autobiography, he's writing an elegy for an entire region, and a region that he didn't grow up in. He's from Ohio. He grew up in Ohio. He spent summers and he spent time back in Kentucky. but he did not grow up in the region.
Right.
And trying to put his experiences and the experiences of of his mother with all of her demons and all of her issues as somehow indicative of an entire region, of even if you're looking at just the core region, you're talking about 6 states, millions of people, and basically saying, hey, this is what they're all like. They're all fighting, and they're all, violent, and they're all drug addict. That part is infuriating because that is the same trope that's been going on for 150 years.
Yeah.
Right.
So in the period after the Civil War, there was this kind of literature called local color. And so it was journalists from urban areas like Baltimore and DC and other places, and they wanted to write about interesting places around the country. And because Appalachia wasn't that far away, they would go and they would seek out the people that were the most different. And so, of course, it's looking at people that were impoverished, people that were barely scraping by. And they would write stories about them, and those stories would be very the same thing. How some people make good, some people are able to escape, but it's the culture of poverty, it's the culture of deprivation, it's the culture of this, and that's painting this brush. And even though people just up the holler from them are completely different, their reality is completely different. They painted everyone with the same brush, and some of these stories sold like wildfire because it was just they were in Harper's, and they were in the Atlantic and other so these magazines that we still have to this day, but they sold. And it's literally the exact same trope of, well, it wasn't opioids back then, but it was like the moonshiners and the so impoverished, and because they were Scotch Irish, they liked to fight because they were all clannish, and this stuff of just like, this is like a zombie trope, like we just need to slay it and let it die, but it just won't. And that's my biggest issue. Like, again, his story is incredible. What he faced and the way that he was able to overcome it was very inspiring. But when you try to say that the way that you grew up is the way that everyone grows up, and the demons that your parents and his mother faced are the same demons that everyone faces, that's where it gets annoying. And then also the fact that he footnoted his own autobiography. That you don't footnote an autobiography. You're not pointing out research when it's about your own life.
Right.
So
right.
That's the thing that's irritating. And then the fact that he has somehow become the voice of the region. And there are scholars that have been working in the region, that are from the region, that have been writing for 50 years. People like Dwight Billings at Kentucky, and people like, just Anita Puckett at Virginia Tech, Mimi Pickering at Appalachia. There's just so many people that have written and told the story and the nuanced story and the complicated and complex story, but that doesn't sell as much. And it's no one likes to hear, hey, it's so difficult because you've got extractive industry, and you've got poverty, and you've got rampant capitalism, and then you've got other things that, frankly, just the fact that J.D. Vance has become our voice just pisses most of us off, and in a way that is. So I'm a member of the Appalachian Studies Association, and I think he's been invited at least twice now and has yet to appear. So I don't know if it's just if it's one of those that he just can't fit it into his busy schedule. But strangely enough, he's still able to be on other networks and stuff. But anyway, so J.D. Vance he's not he's irritating.
Well, these tropes that he's reinforcing, it wasn't just, they were persisting before him, right? So it feels just kind of like, he's bringing it into national spotlight even more. Is that true? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And it's still perpetuating. Now everyone goes and interviews all these Trump supporters from these particular regions, and it's all the same kind of, or at least intersecting tropes. It just keeps happening.
Yes.
Right.
And again, like at some degree, people in certain parts of Appalachia, their lives haven't changed for 50 years. Like, they are worse off than their grandparents were, or on par, because of, stagnant wages and with the decline of coal and the decline of timbering and things like that, certain industries are dying. And it is sad, but at the same time, that's not everybody. And some of the some of the stories and the way that they're written are so just patronizing, and that's the thing that's irritating. It's like, oh, we're going to go find, some of the towns in West Virginia that have been decimated because once the coal mines closed, people had to leave because they didn't have a way to make any more income. So they did leave, and so some of these towns are hurting badly. But that's not everywhere. You don't see anyone rolling into Knoxville or to Chattanooga or to Asheville or to Lexington or, other places that are thriving. Greenville, South Carolina, which is technically part. Those cities are doing very well, and and not just their cities, their suburbs. And you don't get the stories from there of the successes that are going on or the thriving small towns that are making a difference. And that's the story that's not told. And that part is sad and frustrating because the region has been exploited for, 300 years, in particular the last 150 years. And so much of its wealth and its beauty have left because of absentee ownership and other things that, so it was almost, and some writers have described it as like an internal colony because so many of the resources were taken away, and the riches produced weren't sort of reinvested back in the region, and there's lots of reasons for that. But it's sort of the natural resources were taken, but the people were not. They didn't reap the benefits of that.
So, do you think that that's the biggest stereotype or misconception about people from the region? Is the impoverished kind of trope that's?
I think so. I think normally, there's kind of two big tropes, and it's sort of weird that they're sort of flip sides of each other. But you've got the degenerate hillbilly, poor, no shoes, no teeth, shiftless, lazy, all of those. But then you also have on the flip side, sometimes when you say Appalachia, people think, oh, tradition. You think sort of it's almost a positive thing, like, oh, it's pretty. It's traditional values in some way. So that you get sometimes there is some positive thing. I mean, they're obviously outweighed by the negative, but you can get sort of this, almost like this yin and this yang, or this sort of Janus idea of two sides. But if you were to ever like Google search, Appalachia and look at the images, it's like for every 10 hillbillies, there's one like, ooh, look how pretty, and so it's, or you get these, obviously all of the caricatures and stereotypes. So I think that's, the impoverished and the hillbilly kind of go hand in hand. You do get some positive things, and those are sometimes, because even in Vance's book, he talked about the family togetherness and the independence. So some of those, even though as it's portrayed in his book are negative, you can pull positive things from that. So I guess I should, my little small caveat. Okay, it's not all negative in his book, just mostly.
One of the words that you used in that discussion was holler, which I definitely associate with Appalachia.
Yes. I think it can be called hollow, but no one, if you say hollow, no one knows what you're talking about. So it's a holler, and it's a, I don't exactly know the strict definition of what a holler is. I can point some out to you, but I don't know.
I always interpret them as sort of like small valleys, but maybe I'm wrong.
It's a small, long valley that usually there's a, one way in, but there's land that's arable and usable, and so people can live close or far. And usually as you go further in, you're going up too. So if you live deep in the holler, you're probably moving up the ridge. So
that's interesting.
Well,
yeah.
It's good that was cleared up, because I heard it and I was like, I don't know what's happening.
The first time I ever heard the word was in, no, not Longmire. What's that? There's a TV show about the federal agent from Kentucky, right? Tennessee?
Justified?
Justified! The first time I ever heard that word, I think, was Justified, and I had to look it up.
Yeah. Now, Justified is actually decent. Like, I will say that's a show that I can watch and reasonably enjoy. I mean, obviously, some of the the bad guys are so over the top that it's almost just like, really. But for the most part, it's a reasonable display of the region. It's obviously not perfect, but it's pretty good. As far as
what about the dialect?
It's decent.
Okay.
Some of because they did get a lot of extras from the region itself, and so a lot of those are fairly good.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, some of the stars aren't necessarily from the region, so theirs is most of the time. Anytime you get an actor and try to teach them that certain things will be really good, and then other things will be meh. I mean, it's oftentimes like the Southern accent just as a whole is hard, just because there's a lot of nuance there. So a really good version is Jude Law in Cold Mountain. A really terrible version is Jake Gyllenhaal in October Sky. I almost had to stop watching the movie. I'm like, this is terrible. Oh man. I mean, he was giving it a decent try, but it's like, man, as linguists, we gotta do some more work. We gotta do some work because it was not good. Not good at all.
So what do you think people are judging when they judge you or other Appalachian speakers for their dialect?
I think it's two things. I think, obviously, first and foremost, so we're all raised in this culture. We're presented with these stereotypes. We're presented with these ideas because not everyone has experience with the region. And so just like most human things, we try to categorize, or, we base on what we've been told. And so if you sort of are inundated with this idea of hillbilly and poor and backwards and, Trump country, to the nth degree, with a little sprinkling of very pretty and traditional and things like that, which some of those are even reinforced. I think that's what we do. The same way that those of us that grew up in the region that may have not had any experience with like New York or Boston or the Midwest, what do we have to default to? What we've sort of absorbed from our culture. And so some of that is positive, about certain areas, and some of it is also negative. And sadly for Appalachia, a lot of it is negative. And so you sort of were inundated with a lot of negativity, sprinkled with some positivity. But that's what we default to because that's the only thing we have. And of course, we like black and white answers. We like good or not so good. But when something is complex and nuanced and there's lots of gray and not just the black and white, that's what people, so for example, when people hear me sometimes and they hear that I'm a PhD and, I wear shoes and have my teeth, there's some cognitive dissonance there. Like, what happens? Like, wait a minute, you're not a, blatant racist or misogynist or things like that. Like, what do we do with it? And you're not poor. I mean, not that I'm like rich, but you're not like dirt poor with, living on a dirt floor. It's weird because I was on an athletic visit to New York and to New York City. And I was there and one of the guys was like, hey man, so you're from Tennessee? He's like, yeah. He just looked at me and said, do you guys have phones there? And I just kind of looked at him and I said, nope, we got 2 cans and a big long string. But I mean, granted, this was a guy that grew up in, I think he may have been from the Bronx and he had no notion. So the only thing that he had was the caricatures. And so he asked somebody literally in the year 2000 if they had phones, which is obviously an absurd question, but it's indicative of what did he had I was the first person from Tennessee that he knew that he had met. So what is he going to do? He's going to default to what he's been presented. And sadly, that picture from a lot of pop culture and even just sort of, just the cultural milieu is negative. And so that's what he did. And of course, back then I didn't have any, notion of how to answer this. So I also then proceeded to insult him about New York and Doidy Street, stuff like that. But again, that was my first trip to New York. So it was sort of like I had to default to my, to my stereotypes too. That's not my proudest moment, but that's just, being transparent.
Well, sometimes when you're put in these situations, you just don't know how to respond.
Exactly.
I wouldn't have known.
Yeah, I was 17, so I really didn't have a lot of world experience in how to navigate something like that. Although I will say, I do have one funny story about a guy, a good friend of mine. So he's probably like the smartest guy I know. So he's an agricultural engineer, and he's basically figuring out ways for us to feed the whole world. Like, this is what he does. So we're at this McDonald's. We'd gone on a trip, and we were coming back from St. Louis. So I don't really remember where we were, but we weren't, very close to home. And my friend has a pretty pronounced Appalachian accent, and he, he just sort of lets it fly because that's who he is and that's who he wants to be. And so he ordered his food, and this guy behind him starts laughing, and then my friend turns around and says, "Can I help you?" And the guy said, "What rock did you crawl out from under?"
Oh my God.
And my buddy goes, and this is fun. Like, he was so quick with this, like, I don't know how, but he was like, "Let me ask you something. Do you know what an algorithm is?" And the guy was like, "No." And he said, "Well, can you tell me what a derivative is?" He's like, "No." And he said, "I didn't think so." He said, "Just because my mouth moves slow doesn't mean my mind does, but apparently yours does." And then he walked off, and it was kind of like, that was
wow,
terrible and amazing at the same time. Like, like both really insulted, but then I'm like, dude, that was like the best comeback I've ever heard. And how did you think of that? And he just walks with his tray and he sits down and he's like, we get all kinds. And it was just funny because he was not really upset after that. And I was going, wow. But what did that guy, what was his stereotype? It was, if you hear somebody talking like that, they're from so far country, so deep in the country that they live under a rock. And that's what he defaulted to. So it was a really just, kind of eye-opening. It's kind of one of those, like, I wanted to be his, like, yes man, but I didn't really know what to say. So I'm just like, yeah.
Take that.
That's my friend.
Yeah. One of the things that I hear a lot is that people from the South and Appalachia, they talk lazy.
Oh, yes.
Can you explain why it's not lazy?
So it's not lazy because, no native speaker speaks lazily. I mean, this is sort of like it's funny because what it is typically Southern vowels. There's this thing called the Southern drawl. And what happens is some vowels get lengthened and they sort of change a little bit over the articulation. So you get something like friend. And so what happens is where most places would be friend. So that middle vowel stays roughly the same as you say it, but in the South it'll change over time. Even though the speaking rate isn't any different, you get the perception of more or longer because it's changing over time. And so when people get that, they're like, oh, they talk slower. And you get the rationale because it's hot, because it's humid and no one wants to move fast. But at the same time, when something is done slower or, you sort of think, okay, why are they doing it slower? They're just not as fast, or they have the ability to, they're choosing not to. So it's usually stems from that. There have been some studies that have looked at speaking rate at various places, and everyone speaks on the average, roughly the same speed. I mean, there are obviously fast speakers in the South and there are slow speakers in the South. The same way there are fast speakers in the Midwest and slow speakers in the Midwest. It's just because of that, the perception, particularly the vowels, that usually, and then also the same thing, sort of the canonical, the caricature, the monophthongization of I or I, that also gives you the perception of being longer, even though it's the same amount of time. It gives you the percept of being longer for the opposite reason. You're expecting it to change and it doesn't. So you're like, oh, that person just isn't raising their tongue because they are choosing not to because they're lazy or it's hot or humid or something. So I think that's probably where it kind of stems from.
Yeah, thank you. I agree.
Yeah.
It's just good to have a phonetician actually explain it rather than me.
And you can always say, everyone speaks roughly the same rate. I mean, there are, faster and slower people, but on the average, everyone's roughly the same. I mean, because we're still understandable. No one's lazy. It's not like it takes that much effort to move your tongue. We just have a different system.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Do we have any other questions, Megan?
I don't think so. Do you have any last words or anything that you would really wish our listeners, which, I mean, we have listeners in the Ivory Coast, so
yeah.
Anything you want them to know about the region or
Sure.
about the dialect? Yeah.
Well, it's a region that is it's very complex. It's one of those that there are some of the greatest people. There are some traditions that are still maintained, There's a lot of complexity. It's a region that's very beautiful, and I am completely biased in that assessment, but I'm okay with that. But it's beautiful. The people are some of the finest people you can meet. The language it's creative, it's playful. It's a way that people have connections to their roots because of some of the idioms and some of the stories and the jack tales and the creativity with the language sort of evokes an earlier time. Even though it's a completely modern instantiation of the language, it does have some evocative features of an earlier time. But it is it's awesome. It's glorious. Please come see it. Meet people, shake their hands, hear their stories, and make your own opinion. Don't listen to everyone in the media. Make your own opinion.
Can I ask you what a Jack story is?
Oh, so Jack Tale. Yeah, that's so. I like Jack and the Beanstalk.
Oh,
yeah. So like Jack where it's about Jack, and Jack's like this little sort of scamp. He's like he gets into mischief and finds his way, usually through his own intuition, finds his way out. So that's sort of the most famous version of Jack and the Beanstalk. But there are all of these Jack tales that everyone hears growing up, and every sort of holler and pocket and region has their own variations on the Jack tales, and so that's one of the other sort of stereotypes, is that they're Appalachian storytellers, which that one is pretty true. Like I know lots of people and they can tell some really good stories. So I guess we'll accept that one. But it's really just it's a tale. It's tales about Jack. He usually gets in some kind of trouble and figures his way out. And there's always sort of, there's mixes of magic and fantasy and stuff in some of them, but some of them are also very down to earth. Like, he's supposed to go do something and decides not to. And how is he going to make it up to his parents? Some things like that. So some of them can be very, magic beans that grow up to this giant, thing in the sky, to he went to the swimming hole rather than go do his chores, something like that.
That's cool. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you
so much.
Yeah, this was really great.
It was. I learned everything because, again, I have lived in Arizona my entire life, so I have not been to Appalachia.
All right. Well, you were more than welcome.
I look forward to
it. We can send you an Appalachia card, so that way you're accepted as one of our own.
Yes. Well, I say Appalachia, so that is the
yes.
first step.
You're in.
Yes.
I have been to Nashville, at least.
There you go. Nice.
It was really nice.
Yeah, go get some hot chicken.
I didn't need any hot chicken. I did buy some hot chicken spice, though, so I could make it on my non-chicken food.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Well, we always end our show with our tagline, which is, don't be an asshole, because that is the message, if you haven't heard it.
Yeah. Do not be an asshole.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks again.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Oh, be joyful. Is that what you're brewing? Does your daddy know that's what you're doing? His little girl's got a reputation out to ruin. She was giving them the country way. Machete in the tree, stove, hand up on a chain. Wouldn't let a woman play in the banjo in the rain. Can't record a tune, but songs always the same. She's a skippy string. Babe, it's alright. I'm gonna wrap you up tonight. Carry you out right on time.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by Chris Ayers for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com.